My dad's face wasn't normal. His usually excited look was replaced by a look of fear and desperation. He quickly grabbed a roll and shoved it into his mouth. His eyes looked like two black holes that reached deep into him and pulled out some kind of primal fear. My mother and other siblings were out of state for a school field trip. Their bus had broken down, so they said they had to stay the night in a hotel. My mother had left some pasta and dinner rolls to tide us over until morning, fortunately. She was an amazing cook. I even looked forward to eating leftovers of her cooking in the morning. My dad was a defense attorney in the city, so he would usually have to drive a good 30 minutes to get to work. Today, the car was in the shop, so he had to take the Red Line train to get to work. I looked at him with concern and faintly asked, "Are you all right, Dad?" He looked up from our dinner and stared into my eyes. His black hole-like pupils sent a shock through my body. "My son, you have no clue what I have seen," my father said. I was waiting in the station for the train when this man came up to me. He was an older man and was wearing a nice suit. He had a cardboard sign around his neck that read, "Praise Christ, his name is blessed," and a picture of a cross under it. I had heard him screaming from the entrance to the station. He had this thick accent. It sounded African. The man was repeating the exact same thing over and over. "Praise Christ! Praise Christ!" occasionally stopping to talk to people. I watched him walk up to this younger couple and begin to yell about how Jesus had given his life for us, and how we didn't respect him anymore. I thought it was sad. My father's voice trailed off then. We had never been in an especially religious family, but we would occasionally go to church to please my grandparents. Hell, I'm leaning towards atheism myself these days. Probably had something to do with my dad going to a Catholic school when he was young. He went to one of those schools you hear about. The ones where the nuns would bash your hands with long rulers if you spoke back to them. Ironic in my opinion. Trying to get kids to believe in God, but pushing them further away with every hit. He cleared his throat and started to speak again. Next, he went up to a Muslim woman, who began to scream at him when he came up to her. Most of the people in the station thought there was going to be a fight. This punk kid standing next to me began to laugh. Skateboard in one hand, iPhone in the other, and a beanie on his head. I was going to scold the kid for laughing, but before I could say anything, the train arrived. I picked up my briefcase and walked on. Nothing really particular happened on the ride to the next stop, besides some woman with her kids and a dog on her lap. The kids were pushing the dog into their arms and trying to get it to stop barking. Who the hell brings their dog on the train anyways? The next stop, I got off to transfer to the Orange Line. As I was about to go down the stairs to get to the next station, the preacher was there. The same guy. This time, he was ranting about how people didn't care about children anymore, and then went on a rant about abortion. The man obviously had a screw loose, but it was just weird seeing him again. He seemed a little different this time, though. His well-groomed hair was now longer. He had a beard, and his suit was a different shade of gray than it was before. But it was the same man, I'm sure of it. This time he was even more angry. I didn't even see him get on the train to get to the station. I was now wondering if the story was going to stop, or if he was going to keep going. I went on to the next station and got off. This time there were only two people in the station, an older woman and an older man. She was sobbing into the man's shoulder, while he looked forward at an ad for Burger King. The man began to drool, and the woman started to cry even harder. Then the preacher was there again. He ran up to them and started screaming at them. He was vicious. He screamed at her about how the president was a devil and how she was a demon for voting for him. He continued to scream at her until the train arrived. I got on and took a seat on the mostly empty train. A man in the corner kept coughing the entire ride, and the preacher had followed me on this time. He stared at me the entire ride, just looking at me with a stern look on his face. His face was cut, and he was wearing a winter jacket. The sign was still around his neck, but now it was wet. The ink dripped down the sign onto the man's boots. He looked older and even had a limp when walking off the train. I got off too and walked to the bus to get home. My father's hands were now in his hair. He was looking down at the table with awestruck eyes. I got on the bus, and the preacher was already there. He looked like a 90-year-old man and was in a hospital gown. He was carrying an IV bag that was hooked directly into his arm. He was pumping some kind of black liquid into his veins. The only other passenger on the bus was that same dog from earlier. It was barking at me this time and looked rabid. The bus ride felt like it took an eternity. And when we finally reached my stop, the bus driver passed it. I had to go up to the front and ask him to stop, but his face, the driver's face, was gone. It was void of any facial features, only flaps of skin covering where the mouth, nose, and ears were supposed to be. His eyes were still there, though. His green eyes looked at me like he was afraid. An upside down was carved into his face. His look was the only thing I needed to see to know that something was wrong. The doors opened and I sprinted away, not looking back once. Every time I reached a new street, I saw the preacher there, with the dog, each time his body more decayed and wearing slightly different clothes. And then I came home, and I came in to eat dinner. This was insane. Had my father snapped? I looked at him with a confused look and begged him to tell me more. But he kept staring behind me. I told him that we can get him help and everything would be all right. Everything wasn't going to be all right, though. Nothing was going to be the same now. My mother would be left alone with me and my siblings. What were we going to do for money? My mother stayed at home. She hasn't had a job since I was born. My father interrupted my thoughts when he began to say something else. Son, everything will be all right, but... He looked directly behind me, and tears started to fall from his eyes. I asked him what he was trying to say, but he ignored me. Believe me, when I tell you that your mother and I love you, my father continued, I began to cry too. I told him how much I loved him and Mom and know everything will be all right. He lifted his hand, though, signaling me to stop talking, and said in a faint voice, Son, he's behind you. Thank you for tuning in. If you like the story, hit that like button. Consider sharing and subscribing to the channel to be alerted to new uploads. If you'd like to see something specific on my channel, leave a comment below and I will look into it. Good night, everyone.